needs and values. So welcome, welcome. If you have any questions at any time, you can feel free to type them in the chat or raise your hand. We're going to be a pretty open group today. So let's go ahead and dive in and get started. So just as a roadmap today, we are going to start out by framing our understanding of educator well-being and where we're at right now. Then we will dive into a short discussion on the value of self-care and what self-care really looks like before we work on centering that self-care around our values, diving into some practical self-care practices, and then leaving some time for reflecting, discussing, and committing to some practice. So if you want a copy of today's presentation, Anna has dropped that in the chat, and she'll do that a few more times as people join in. So if you need any resources from that, feel free. So you don't need to take pictures. I love taking pictures of presentations, so I'm always glad when they instead drop it in the chat. So first off, I want to give you a moment to just think on a question. What do all of these professions have in common? Now, some of them may look similar just right off of the bat, but there's a few that stick out. So I want you to take a moment to consider, what do these professions and jobs all have in common? We've got nuns from the specific order of the Missions of Charity, formerly run by Mother Teresa. We got some physicians, nurses, counselors, social workers, tech developers, and psychologists. What is it that they all have in common? Tony typed in, they're all providing service. This is true. It's hard to find a job these days that doesn't provide a service. But that's very true. They all provide a specific service and they all serve somebody specifically. Caretakers, interesting. Well, tech developers, I don't know. Although I've met a few tech developers that are very caring. They're all social. They all have focuses on helping people in various ways, yeah. At the core, like, these are all very true ideas, but at the core, the one thing that ties all of those together is that they're professions that see self-care as a necessity. For many of them, it is a defined ethical responsibility of the profession. So for social workers, for example, social worker organizations around the country have rallied together to make clear statements that they believe that it is an ethical responsibility for social workers to maintain and practice self-care. Because if you're not practicing self-care as a social worker, how are you going to be able to show up for those that you're caring for? This is also true of nurses, psychologists, and counselors. They all have that ethical imperative to focus on their self-care. Those social workers that I mentioned earlier, they even have coursework in many states that is required for social work licensure to practice self-care. So they have courses around self-care specifically built for social workers in those programs. That's how seriously they take it. And in some professions, if you're not practicing your self-care and something happens, well, you can be held liable because you weren't doing enough to take care of yourself. Therefore, you made these mistakes at work. That's a really interesting concept. We also see the prevention of compassion fatigue as a reasoning behind these this career focus on self-care. Those nuns in the Catholic order, for example, Mother Teresa had a rule that every 5 years, as if a nun practiced in that order for 5 years, then after that 5 years, that nun had to take a leave of absence to recharge and refuel to fight against the ever-looming image of compassion fatigue, meaning the inability to maintain compassion for those that you're caring for. This is also something that preserves creativity. So in the case of the tech developer especially, companies like Google, Apple, large tech development companies, and small ones, even like Classcraft, for example, they look at self-care as a means of preserving creativity in their workforce so that they can come to work and find creative solutions to problems. And this is also something that fosters resilience. So in any of those professions and careers on the previous slide, we see a growth in the ability to bounce back from failure and from challenge because of the practice of self-care. As a tech developer, that's an amazing tool and resource to have under your belt so that you can be faced with problems in the workplace and problem solve around them. As a counselor or a therapist, you're faced with a lot of other people's trauma all day long. And in order to be resilient against taking those on yourself, you need to practice self-care. So let's think about our profession now. Now, in the field of education, self-care is not an ethical imperative yet. I like to say that word yet because I feel that that self-care is a powerful thing. And as a caring profession, as educators and teachers, self-care is a valuable thing so that we can make sure that we're able to be present in our jobs every day. But because self-care isn't an ethical imperative, and because it is not taught to our pre-service teachers, and because our mentor programs do not focus on self-care, we find there's a lot of consequences to this. There's a lot of words up here on the screen that I'm not going to read aloud to you, but I think that if you're reading through, you can find at least one of those that you are feeling right now. I know that myself in my teaching career, I spent a lot of time feeling very trapped and cornered even. This resulted in a lot of feelings of depression, of internal struggles that I wasn't really prepared to deal with because I didn't have the means to process. So as a result of all of this, as a result of self-care not being a priority in our profession, as a result of all of these emotions and feelings that we're having, we're finding that we're struggling to show up for ourselves. We're struggling to provide ourselves with the coping mechanisms that we need to get through the day. We're finding that it's hard to show up for our students and to be there and be compassionate for them. It's hard to show up for our own families. I know that after my classroom career was finished, I realized how much I lost connection with my own immediate family. It's hard to be there for ourselves and to think and act creatively in this. So when you're in the midst of all of this, it's really hard to look at a standard and look at a lesson and think of creative ways to meet students' needs, to think outside the box. And at the core, it is impossible to enjoy your work. We cannot enjoy our work when we're feeling these things. Even one thing on this list can really magnify and make it difficult to be in our workplace. And yes, Salvatore, great point. All of this is absolutely magnified by the pandemic. That word grieving is one that I put in there specifically because of our current state in the pandemic. We are grieving the loss of our old classroom routines and procedures. We're grieving seeing those faces every day. We're grieving our own personal losses, our own personal loss of family members in worst case scenarios, of contact with others. There's a lot to work through here. And the pandemic only makes all of this worse. And then on top of that, the ever-shifting sands that we sit on. So tomorrow's vote, for example, is something that has a lot of us feeling fear, trepidation, a lot of things. And because of that, we need to perform some self-care around it. So right now in the field of education, we have this very simple view of teacher well-being. Either you're doing good, feeling content, having a good day, or you're stressed and having a hard time. And oftentimes, if, for example, one of your coworkers comes to you and says, "Hey, how you doing?" and you respond with, "I'm feeling stressed," you'll either get back some like, "Oh, that sucks, that's rough, how can I help?" which is awesome, or you might have this language around, "Oh, you must not be doing enough to take care of yourself," which then builds up this idea around self-care being this guilt. Oh, I need to take care of myself. I need to do self-care. What does that even mean? Then we start thinking about the oversimplification of the idea of self-care as hashtag self-care Sunday. I'm going to take a bath with a bath bomb and I'm going to have a mimosa. Oh, that can be self-care for sure, but that's not the whole image of what self-care is. And really, at the end of the day, this oversimplification of what teacher wellness is focuses on the symptoms. It just focuses on the base level of what you're feeling in that moment, rather than understanding that teacher wellness is influenced by a range of factors that are historical, social, and cultural that influence our current state of being. To take a deeper look at this, in one of the pieces of research that I read about pre-K teacher self-care and wellness, I found this amazing graphic about the various factors that influence teacher well-being. And I want to encourage us to use this to rethink our idea of our well-being. So here on this chart, you see that there are two main sections. There's contextual factors and individual factors. Contextual factors focus on the things around us, our greater society, our professional obligations, and the policies in which we teach, which we know very well can affect our well-being. When changes occur to our evaluations, for example, that affects and impacts our well-being dramatically. Organizational factors and leadership. When orders come down from on high at City Center, that's something that definitely impacts our well-being. And it goes all the way down to our environment in which we practice and those in that environment. So this is the conditions in which we teach. Right now, our conditions are largely on this online environment, and that has its own impacts on our well-being. But thinking back to last year when we were in the classroom setting, there were conditions there that affected our well-being as well. If we would go into a classroom that was well kept and well lit and glorious, well, then it felt good to be in there. It addressed some contextual factors of our well-being in a positive way. But if we went into a classroom and some of the ceiling joists were rusty and the paint hadn't been updated in a few years and it was real obvious, and there may have been a mouse or two living in there over the summer, well, that impacts our teacher well-being in a negative way. Then we also have our individual factors in terms of well-being. So this goes from everything from our own teaching role, whether we feel suited for it. For example, I feel very well suited to teach first grade. That's really something that I have a lot of experience with. So if you took me in my first grade teaching role and put me into high school chemistry, well, I know about chemistry, but I would feel completely out of my element. That would affect my well-being in a highly negative way. Then we also have other personal factors. These are things that are going on in our personal life. If you have strife and struggle in your personal life, that's going to affect your well-being as an educator. And then, of course, our knowledge and competencies. Do I feel that I have the knowledge and the competency within my field to feel successful? And that also goes for honoring your knowledge and competencies outside of the field of education, because that's what gives you a personal identity. Oftentimes, as educators, we take on the personal identity of being a teacher. I am a teacher. This is my identity. This is who I am. But oftentimes that can also negatively impact our well-being because we are complex individuals. And as complex individuals, we need to honor all of that complexity. So for example, yeah, I'm an educator, but I'm also an embroiderer. I'm also a musician. I'm also a lot of other things, an editor, and a lot of other little things that make up who and what the picture of me looks like. So these factors all influence our teacher well-being in one way or another. And of course, if our teacher well-being is looking strong, then our relationships improve. And if our relationships improve, then that positively impacts child well-being. And the same is true if our contextual factors and individual factors are causing us some strife and struggle. Our well-being disintegrates, our relationships disintegrate, and child well-being within our environment has a harder time. Notice also that each of these factors have overlap. That's because they relate to one another in lots of ways. There's no one part of our life that doesn't influence another. So honoring that overlap and honoring those shifts is really important. So as you're considering your state of well-being, think about each of these factors and how each of these factors is influenced by each other. By targeting those areas that may be having some struggle, we can address our well-being in a more efficient and effective way. So then, now that we have a better idea of the various realms of well-being, let's think about what self-care is. Now, I made a reference earlier to hashtag self-care Sunday. If you're ever on Instagram and you search hashtag self-care, you will see any number of things pop up as to what self-care is. And it can be any number of things. But what is self-care to one person is not necessarily self-care to another. And that's because self-care is the process of actively and purposefully initiating methods that promote your holistic well-being. Now, by holistic, I mean that whole picture of well-being. I'm not talking about like holistic medicine or ringing bells or whatever. I'm talking about that entire picture of what well-being looks like. So this could be any number of things, from practicing your hobbies to mindfulness, practicing leisure activities, sleep is self-care, using coping strategies or setting boundaries. I put that one on there specifically as a plug for our other presentations on boundary setting. And so this image here is one that I pulled from an integrative health and wellness assessment tool piece of research around nursing. And this is a way that they helped to build nurses' capacity for performing self-care that addresses health and wellness in lots of different domains. So they were able to point to issues with relationships, for example, and say, well, how can I perform self-care within my relationship? And they then took that and made an intentional plan for it. There's also mental self-care, environmental, doing things around your environment that make it a place where you feel healthier and you improve your sense of well-being. That's self-care. Even if at the time, maybe cleaning the baseboards doesn't feel like self-care, in the long run, it can positively influence your well-being. So this is a nice, handy way for us to take the image on the previous slide and translate it to a few ideas for how we can begin conceptualizing our self-care. So when you practice self-care, you'll see a lot of benefits. When you practice it with a lot of intentionality and by actively initiating it, then you'll see some improvements in mental health. You'll see better relationships with your students, an increased ability to regulate emotions, greater mental flexibility, so that ability to bounce back after a fall or think around problems in different ways. It also prevents your burnout. It also helps you to feel those feelings of compassion and so much more. Self-care is a surprisingly well-researched area, and in every piece of research that I read and found, no matter the field in which it was performed, the benefits were clear for everyone involved in the studies. So I highly recommend looking into self-care for yourself in that way. So before I pass it off to Anna to describe some really purposeful methods for bringing in value-centered self-care, I want to leave you with a few ideas. So before you begin your practice in self-care, consider these. First, self-care does not need to be separate from your work. In fact, it can and should go hand in hand. In a caring profession such as ours, we need to be prepared to care, no matter if we teach high school or pre-K. So that self-care needs to walk hand in hand with your career. It's also a purposeful process. As I've said before, this is intentional and centered around your wellness in whatever domain that might be. Self-care doesn't just magically happen. It's something that needs to really be planned and purposeful. And then last, it needs to connect to your purpose, your why, your reason for practicing in this career, in this place. And so it needs to be value-centered. And with that, I'm going to pass this along to my colleague, Anna, to talk about what value-centered really means.
Thank you so much, Molly. I'm always really inspired by Molly's attention to detail when it comes to research and applying research to our work. So we're going to take that foundation that Molly has created around well-being and contextual self-care and just drill a little bit deeper into creating and maintaining self-care practices that are driven by our values. So the term values casts a pretty wide net, right? It can encompass a lot of different things for different people. Today, when we're talking about values, we are considering the elements in our lives that give us purpose and meaning, that help us to be content in our own personal power, however that looks for us. Our values help to connect us to our authentic self and sometimes help us to kind of feel whole. And they also can help us to determine our priorities in life. So here we have some examples of value categories. Now, some of these value categories may connect to your own personal values, but I'm sure all of us can add pretty extensively to this list, as we may not see our particular value categories listed here. This particular list of value categories came from Russ Harris's book called The Confidence Gap. So Russ Harris is known for his work in acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. If you're a school that uses AIM, you might be familiar with ACT. Russ Harris also wrote the book The Happiness Trap, which is also a good read. So in his work, Harris points out that it can be sometimes a little bit difficult for us to identify and narrow down our values. And perhaps that's because we've never really been asked to identify our values. Like Molly was saying, right, this wasn't a part of our teacher prep program, for example. It could be that we're just not really given the time or permission to kind of focus on this and what our values look like. Or maybe that our values have changed over time in light of recent events in our lives. So Harris recommends one strategy, if you are having a hard time kind of narrowing down those values, is to think about what you value in others. So by denoting what we value in our heroes, for example, or the people that we have the closest relationships with, that can help us to tap in to where our own values in life lie. So we're going to do a quick reflect, kind of with this list in mind. And if Molly, if you could bump us over to the next one, awesome, thank you. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to write down somewhere in the ballpark of your top 5 core values. 5 más o menos. Remember, these are the things in life that give us purpose and help us to connect to our most whole and authentic selves. So just on a scratch piece of paper, we're going to give you 3 minutes. I'm going to mute myself and just take this moment to kind of reflect on what are my core values as a person and also perhaps as an educator. So we'll take about 1 more minute, and we're just writing down our top 5 core values. And you won't be asked to share this. I should have said that at the beginning, so no worries. This won't be shared with the greater public. So as you find yourself kind of coming to a stopping point, I'm going to ask you to kind of keep those in front of you because we're going to use them again momentarily. And now with those core values in front of us, I'm going to ask us to kind of pivot to this idea of action-oriented values. So what does this mean and how does this help? When we're thinking about action-oriented values, we're thinking about values that lend themselves to purposeful effort to engage. So Salvador dropped in the chat, self-care sounds so foreign to me. And I'm really glad you said that. That was an excellent segue. That sometimes thinking about self-care and sometimes thinking about our values, those are foreign because they're kind of things that we maybe just kind of put on a shelf to do later. And so we're going to take this idea of action-oriented values, or turning our values into action statements, to help point us in the direction of some productive self-care. So if you came to our boundaries PD last month, or oh gosh, many months ago, time is meaningless now. Molly did a really good job of explaining that our boundaries have to be really specifically defined because that helps us to defend them. The same is true for our values. When we have a really firm understanding of our values and what they look like and what that means for us, it's easier for us to prioritize them and to defend them. So now, we're going to do a little more work with those values. We have our top core values sitting in front of us. And we're going to look at those values now through an action-oriented lens. So for example, one of my core values is personal and professional relationships. That's the value. But I want to ensure that I'm specifically defining this core value so that I can defend it, prioritize it, and put forth a purposeful effort to engage with it through my self-care practices. So I'm going to reframe this as an action statement. My new action statement being, I want to engage and connect with others through a lens of curiosity, kindness, and acceptance. So the challenge here is taking that core value, looking at it a little deeper and what it means to us, and deciding how we want to engage with that value through an action-oriented lens. So I'm going to give you another 3 minutes. I'm going to ask you to go back to those core values that you denoted and see if you can change them into these action statements. And I know it feels like we've kind of moved from self-care, but we'll go back there. We'll get back to that. So 3 minutes, take your time. And again, this won't be shared. We'll take about 1 more minute to finish this up. So I'm going to kind of go off the script here for a second and pop in an off-the-cuff reflection question. And just maybe pose to the group. You can either answer in the chat or just kind of think about this to yourself. How was this for you, kind of on the easy to hard 1 to 5 scale? I personally found the first time I did this, it was easy for me to come up with my values. It was much harder for me to turn them into these action statements. Easy, awesome. Tony, way to go. Yeah, Salvador, absolutely. We're supposed to put everybody else first, right? This is this expectation. This is, like Molly said, part of our identity in a lot of ways. Hard, yeah. This is challenging. this heart work can be hard. Valerie, absolutely. Absolutely. It can be challenging. Well, thank you for humoring me there. I guess that does make me feel a little better, that it was like, ooh, I wasn't the only one that kind of was on the struggle bus the first time I did this. Okay, so now let's take those action statements that we have, and now let's come back to that self-care. So now comes kind of the fun part, I think, where we get to take the theory and ideas that Molly shared with us about purposeful and sustainable self-care that moves away from that kind of oversimplification of self-care and that hashtag Sunday self-care business, and blend that with our unique action-oriented core values. So this is going to help us to identify self-care practices that focus on our individual needs, right? Which means these self-care practices are going to be dynamic. They can change depending on context or with time. They're going to be holistic in nature, right? Focusing on our whole self and the various contexts or facets of our life. And they're congruent with those diverse facets, right? This isn't, if I identify as a teacher, right, that's part of my identity, it doesn't mean my self-care isn't going to be only massages, right? The self-care also has to feed that teacher soul and be congruent with my job and the work that I'm doing throughout the day. And it's also self-care that points us in the direction of defending and prioritizing our values and purpose. So now, as we're looking at self-care, we're going to break it into two categories. The idea of self-care that gives ourselves time to pause, and self-care that gives us time to cultivate joy. So on this next slide, you're going to see a list. I came up with my own personal list of self-care practices that help me to take time to pause. And what I mean by taking time to pause, that means intentionally taking a momentary break from the stressors I experience. Or perhaps taking a break that allows me to recognize and sit with the emotions that come from those stressors. So both taking a break from and recognizing and confronting our emotions is healthy, right? That helps with resiliency. It helps to defeat burnout and signs of anxiety and depression. So here are just some examples of my self-care list of ways that I intentionally pause. So it's taking a break from social media, maybe looking at a photo album, reading a good book, doing some mindfulness, taking a quiet walk. That's been an important one lately as I'm staring at a screen all day, taking a nap. And all of these kind of point back to those contextual factors that Molly was talking about. This feeds my identity in a lot of different ways. It also kind of helps me to move away from that oversimplification of self-care. These are things I can do throughout the day that feed my soul and give me that time to pause. Now, our second category, time to cultivate joy. These are activities that provide space for joy, right? We all need more of that J factor in our lives. And once again, these activities may help us to take a break from stressors, or they may help us to acknowledge and sit with and perhaps confront some of those stressors. So again, these are just my examples of a couple of self-care strategies. Of course, I would love to put like getting a deep tissue massage and going on a vacation to a private island, right? That would all be self-care. But for my purpose today, I'm thinking about like the here and now, the self-care that I can just integrate into my workday, maybe do on the weekends, but feeds all of those contextual factors. And as I'm collecting these self-care strategies and trying on and experimenting with new self-care practices, I'm also mindful of how these strategies point me in the direction of my values, right? So because we know that self-care is much more sustainable and accessible and often beneficial when it does connect with those values. So for me, a lot of the things on this list point me in the direction of three of my values: relationships with others, my health and fitness, and also my value of self-preservation. Okay, so now the big reveal. When we put it all together, we're going to use a really wonderful tool. There's a lot of links on this document. I'm going to kind of talk you through them pretty quickly. Here on the left, where it says click here to access the reflection graphic organizer, you have a link to a reflection document called A Pathway to Pause. This graphic organizer was created by Tamisha Williams. Tamisha is the Director of Equity and Community Initiatives at the Potomac School. And she's also a consultant with Tamisha Williams Consulting. That's her picture right here on the right. Molly and I attended a PD that she gave at the Sophia Center a couple of months ago. And Tamisha so generously gave us permission to share this tool with you all. We're very grateful that she shared it with us. So if you enjoy this tool, don't thank us because we didn't make it. You can thank Tamisha. Under her picture, there's a link to her website. She has some really wonderful resources for you to explore. And this month especially, she has so many culturally responsive Black History Month resources and lesson plans. So check out her website. And also on that side, we have a link to the Sophia Center website. We wanted to give them some credit because they provided the space for us to learn from Tamisha. So you can click on their little swirl icon to go to their website, or the link below to get like a one-pager about their organization and what they do. They hold free monthly PDs that are really exceptional, and I really deeply encourage you to check them out. So let's go back to that graphic organizer, that link there. And I'm also going to drop a link to that in the chat. I think that's it. Molly, can you check that link? I just suddenly had fear that that wasn't the right one. If it's not, I'll fix it. So that link should force you to make a copy of this tool, so you'll have your own. Now, this tool has 4 slides. We're going to be using slides 3 and 4. Slides 1 and 2 are kind of simplified versions, but we're going to dig into the deeper ones. So slide 3, we'll go ahead over to our next slide. Slide 3 and slide 4 are going to look like this pathway to pause. Now, you have some choices as to how you engage with this tool. If you have a printer available, you can print out slide number 3 and write right on this document. Or you can type directly into slide 4. You can just type right into it. Or you can just kind of use this as a visual guide and write this out on a piece of paper. The first time I did it, I kind of used her graphic and then I just wrote on paper. So you're the boss of you here. However you want to engage with this is fine with us. So we're going to ask you to consider starting at the bottom of this tool and begin by listing your personal values. Now, in this document, Tamisha describes this as how we show up for our community. But this can also be how we show up for our family or for ourselves. Really just focusing on those values here at the bottom. And you can write them as your core values or as your action-oriented values that we denoted earlier. And then as we move up that document, we're going to focus on our needs during that time. So that place where the river is, those are our needs right now. So thinking about those contextual factors that Molly was talking about. And finally, using the space at the top of the document, the mountains and sky, to describe specific ways that we plan to engage in value-centered self-care. This is our plan. So those of us who feel like we're maybe not doing a lot of self-care, this is some space to think about how we can take those first steps, either to create moments for pause or moments that cultivate joy. So you'll see on the next slide, we're going to give you 10 minutes for this personal reflection time. This time is yours to engage with this graphic organizer in a way that's most meaningful for you. We are just going to encourage you. I know it's really hard for us not to kind of jump back into our work, but we so rarely have the opportunity to just sit and focus on ourselves. So we ask that you do take these 10 minutes to really engage with this document or some other self-care that you might be in need of. Molly and I are going to remain in this space. If you have questions, feel free to unmute. But this time is yours. So we will come back at 9:05 for the next piece. So take these 10 minutes, use this document as you see fit, and we'll be here if you need us. Just for a little time check, we have about 3 more minutes. So we're going to ask you to just kind of finish up where you are, and come back to the meat space. You don't have to turn your camera back on, but um, just kind of find a stopping point. I want to thank you for taking the time to engage with this tool. I know it can feel stressful and maybe uncomfortable to prioritize this type of activity, especially in the middle of a workday. So thank you for challenging yourself in that way, and for engaging in this with us. So as our time is kind of coming to a close, I'm just going to give us a little bit of an invitation to reflect on the experience of using that tool. I know we're a relatively large group, but I know a lot of us kind of have like breakout room fatigue. So we're not going to go into breakout rooms. We're just going to pose these questions, and just invite you, as you feel comfortable, to maybe use the chat to respond, or to unmute if you feel comfortable. If we kind of jostle around talking over each other, don't worry, we'll figure it out. Sometimes there's that uncomfortable silence when we pose some questions, so we're just going to lean into that and give space for people to reflect as they feel comfortable. So Molly and I are going to ask you to consider, what was this reflective experience like for you, and what did it bring up for you, perhaps mentally or emotionally? How did you connect with this information today? What are your next steps in terms of value-centered self-care? And how could you use this information as your role as a TLF? You don't have to answer all of those, maybe just the one that speaks to you. Awesome. Thank you, Valerie. Valerie told us that she wants to share some of those slides with her teachers. Awesome.
I think for me, like at the beginning, really realizing that maybe I haven't been thinking about my values really, like trying to come up with like, what are my values, and having like a set thing isn't something I've really thought about a lot. And so it's kind of eye-opening to kind of figure out like, what do I value in life? So that I really liked it.
Awesome. Aubrey, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that.
As I mentioned earlier, this was extremely difficult, and I use the word extreme on purpose. This was extremely difficult because I think as teachers, we are taught to put everybody else, and really the way our jobs are handled, we're taught to put everybody before ourselves. And so I basically found myself staring at the page, wondering either A, what should I do here? Or B, even worse, how can I use this with my students? What can I take here? Because I mean, my kids are reading The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens. So I'm thinking, how can I bring this to them instead of thinking of how can I use this for myself? Because again, it's everybody else first. And in looking at some of your slides on the joy stuff, and I mean, I work out in the morning, I read, I have music things that I do. But all of them, there's always that thought in the back of your mind that goes, oh crap, did I forget to grade that little piece of paper? Or, oh man, that lesson for tomorrow, is it ready to go? Got that parent who emailed me 6 times because I haven't gotten back to their kid yet about an assignment that they turned in late, but they want me to grade right away.
Right.
So it's all of those things combined, and I mean, I've been at this thing for over almost 30 years now. And when that's ingrained in you, turning off teacher brain, exactly. That's the hardest part, is turning off teacher brain, because no matter where you are, you're thinking, gosh, what can I do to bring, it's always about bringing it back to the kids or something related to school. As I saw Molly kind of like going, yeah. It's tough. It's really tough.
Absolutely. And Salvatore, thank you for bringing that up, because I don't know that we touched on the fact that it's one thing to engage in the self-care. It's a whole nother skill set to be fully present in that self-care, right? And not thinking about the papers I have to grade, or how am I going to bring this back to my students? Thank you for voicing that. That's really important. I've seen kind of in the chat the idea of like vulnerability and just kind of giving teachers
Did Anna freeze or didn't I freeze?
I was just asking myself the same question. I think Anna froze for a moment, but to kind of pick up where she was leaving off, it's about making this space, right, to be vulnerable. Like Valerie was just saying, I love hearing other teachers talk about their troubles, because it feels like I'm not alone. I spent so much time personally as an educator feeling alone in my depression, in my burnout, and all of these things. And it made me feel like I was being a bad teacher because I was feeling those things. But the honest to goodness truth is that we all have needs and we all have feelings that are valuable. And we need to do the work to not only lift each other up, but to create a culture where it's okay to do these things. So these comments are just amazing, everyone. Absolutely amazing.
I agree. I was hearing Tripiti talk about, he just mentioned casually about that parent who emailed 6 times to force you to grade the kid's paper which turned in late. Like, story of my life. And that's why I think I'm the only teacher in the whole world that deals with parents, making everything my fault. I don't know why I think that. I'm like, no, I'm the only teacher that has parents that treat me like this, and this is why I suck. And it's not true, because obviously No.
Absolutely, Valerie. Absolutely. And the thing is, too, is that our stress brain, so our brains are crazy. They're insane. They're strange. They're animal brains and then logical brains. And then sometimes the animal brain takes over. And sometimes when you're in that headspace of, I'm the only one that feels this, I'm alone, I am struggling, why is this happening to me? That's your animal brain kind of spiraling, right? And self-care is a way that we can rein that in and pull it back so that we can say, wait a minute, this is something that a lot of us are feeling. My feelings are valid. And I am good at my job. Like I'm here for a reason, and it's because that aligns with my values. So how do I work with that? And Aubrey just mentioned imposter syndrome. Oh my gosh, imposter syndrome is so real. I think that it's like this sensation of, for those of you who aren't familiar with imposter syndrome, it's the sensation of, I'm a faker and somebody's going to find out soon. Like I am just faking my way through my career. I am stumbling through to try to figure this out as I go. And anything that goes right isn't really attributed to me. It was an accident, and somebody's going to figure me out, and I'm going to be exposed. But the reality is that we all struggle with these things, and honoring that and being vulnerable with it is how we grow. So thanks. And Salvatore, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, and if I can add one more thing, there's no denying that we are all very passionate about our jobs. And I think that passion and our self-care is often affected by the thoughts and opinions of, as Joelle said, outside factors, especially now with this vote coming up. I don't know how many posts I'm seeing about lazy teachers and good for nothing teachers who aren't working and are just sitting in their PJs at home in front of their computers and drinking Mai Tais and thinking they're on a beach somewhere. It's crazy. And if we don't think that affects us, then, we're right. Eating bonbons. Exactly right. I mean, we're in a pandemic, and I don't think people understand that. And here we are, practicing self-care. And I'm sorry, I don't mean, I hope this doesn't get too, but practicing self-care by wanting to make sure that there are many of us who are fighting for being vaccinated before going back, and we're getting pushback for taking care of ourselves. I mean, that to me,
Absolutely.
that vaccination is part of self-care, is part of taking care of ourselves, and
That's
we're
a
getting
very good point.
pushback for it.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing voice to that. I hate to bring the conversation to a close, but I do know that another group is coming in here at 9:30. I would love to just stay on this call with all of you. I just want to take another moment to thank you for spending some time with us today. We do have in the slide deck a lot of further reading for you personally, or to share with your teachers. And please, we encourage you to keep this conversation going. We ask you to reach out to Molly and I as questions or comments come up. And we just, from the bottom of our hearts, just a really deep bow of gratitude for all of you, for being vulnerable here this morning, and for sharing your time with us. We really appreciate you and the work that you do.
I'm sorry, just before you guys leave,